Let's start with something critical. Most people think focus is purely a mental skill. They treat it like a mindset, something you either have or don't. But that's not how the brain works. Focus is not a mindset. It's a state, and that state is built from neurochemistry. When we talk about winning battles with focus, we're talking about learning to control that internal state on demand. Because if you can control focus, you can direct actions. If you can direct action, you can shape outcomes. When you sit down to do something important, study, build, train, write, what's really happening inside your brain is the activation of a triad of neurochemicals: dopamine, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine. This is your brain's precision system. Dopamine locks in motivation and anticipation. Acetylcholine sharpens sensory input and learning. Norepinephrine increases alertness and energy. Together, they form what you could call a neurological spotlight. They tell the rest of your brain, this is what matters. Block everything else out. But here's where it gets interesting. These chemicals don't appear automatically just because you want them to. Wanting to focus is not the same as being in a focused state. You need to prime your system because the brain responds to inputs, specific, repeatable inputs. Take dopamine, for example. People think of dopamine as a pleasure chemical. That's incomplete. Dopamine is about pursuit, the desire to act, and it's highly sensitive to anticipation and novelty. So if your environment is filled with random dopamine triggers, notifications, pop-ups, scrolling, you're teaching your brain to expect stimulation without effort. That's the exact opposite of focus. You're training distractions. To reverse that, you need to create a context that supports focus. The simplest place to start your morning. What you do in the first 90 minutes after waking sets your dopaminergic tone for the rest of the day. If you immediately go to your phone, scroll, or consume fragmented content, you spike dopamine in a shallow way. That leads to a crash. Your motivation drops, your attention becomes scattered, and suddenly you're chasing stimulation rather than completing work. Instead, begin with what your brain and body are wired for: sunlight. Natural light hitting the eyes first thing in the morning regulates your circadian rhythm, tells your brain it's time to be alert, and begins the slow, steady rise of cortisol and dopamine in a healthy pattern. This is fundamental biology, not personal development advice. You're interacting with the suprachiasmatic nucleus in your hypothalamus. That's your body's master clock. You set the rhythms, or you fight it all day long, then delay caffeine intake for 90 minutes. Why? Because during sleep, your brain builds up a molecule called adenosine. It creates the feeling of sleep pressure. When you wake, adenosine is still circulating. If you slam caffeine right away, you mask that pressure temporarily, but it builds behind the scenes, and you crash hard around midday. Wait 90 minutes, let your natural alertness rise, and then layer in caffeine to extend and support focus. You're working with your biology not against it. Now, once you sit down to work, you need to think of attention as a resource you direct, not something you wait to feel. The brain can't multitask. It switches tasks, and each switch comes at a cost. Even a glance at your phone creates a residue, a lingering distraction that makes re-entry into deep work slower and more cognitively expensive. So eliminate friction, close tabs, choose one task, engage with it fully. You're signaling to the prefrontal cortex that this is your priority. And that matters because the prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function. It governs willpower, discipline, and delayed gratification. Here's a critical shift. Don't try to focus all day. That's a myth. Your brain operates in ultradian cycles, natural 90-minute peaks of alertness followed by dips. Use that rhythm. Work deeply for 90 minutes, then take a 15-minute break. Not a scrolling break, a walk, a reset. Something that allows default mode networks to activate. Those are the background processes where insight and creativity emerge. You're not being lazy. You're recovering attention. Focus is a biological system that operates best under patterns. When you establish rituals, same time, same place, same entry point, you teach your brain to transition into deep work faster. This is called contextual conditioning. If every time you sit at a certain desk with a certain playlist and open a certain notebook, your brain will begin to associate that environment with single tasked focus. You're literally building a neural shortcut. And when distractions arise, and they will, use techniques to pull yourself back. One of the fastest, a visual anchor. Keep your gaze fixed on a single point. When your eyes lock in, your mind begins to follow. It's called gaze anchoring, and it reduces wandering thoughts. Another tool is breath. A simple double inhale followed by a long exhale, what's called the physiological sigh, drops your stress state and re-centers attention almost immediately. You're taking conscious control of the autonomic nervous system, shifting from sympathetic arousal into a focused parasympathetic mode. Focus isn't about forcing the mind. It's about aligning biology with intention. It's training the internal system through repetition and design. And it's knowing that when you control your inputs, manage your environment, and respect your rhythms, your brain will reward you with clarity, energy, and execution. When we talk about winning wars, the long game of success, growth, health, mastery, what we're really talking about is the ability to do something not once, not twice, but over and over again until the behavior becomes automatic and the identity becomes inevitable. This is the difference between people who shine for a moment and people who last, between those who burn bright and those who build legacies. And the reason most people don't win that war isn't because they lack motivation. It's because they don't understand the science of consistency. So let's be clear, consistency is not about doing the same thing at the same time every day. It's about something much deeper. It's about how your brain encodes identity through repetition. Every time you repeat a behavior, you're not just completing a task, you're shaping the architecture of your nervous system. You're reinforcing a circuit. You're telling your brain, this is who I am. There's a structure in your brain called the basal ganglia. It's one of the most powerful regions when it comes to habit formation. It stores routines, patterns, and motor sequences that eventually run without conscious thought. This is how you can drive a car, type on a keyboard, or tie your shoes without thinking. Once the behavior becomes automatic, it moves from the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center, to the basal ganglia, where it becomes part of your identity scaffold. This shift from conscious to automatic is exactly what we want when we're building consistency. Because if every day feels like a grind, if every habit requires discipline and force, you'll run out of willpower. The system has to become automatic. And the fastest way to get there is to make the behavior repeatable, frictionless, and emotionally rewarding. Now let's talk about what really happens when you repeat a habit over time. Each repetition strengthens a neural connection, much like walking a path through grass. The more you walk it, the more worn the path becomes. Eventually, it becomes the default route, the path of least resistance. That's how habits work neurologically. But here's where most people get stuck. They think the goal is perfection. They think they have to go hard every day with no breaks, no bad days, no failures. That's a trap. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is pattern. Pattern builds identity. Identity sustains action. If you're building a morning routine, a workout practice, a learning discipline, it's better to do 5 minutes a day every day than 1 hour once a week. Why? Because frequency beats intensity. Your brain is tracking consistency of behavior, not the magnitude of behavior. Dopamine, that reward molecule, doesn't spike when you do something perfectly. It spikes when you complete what you told yourself you would do. That's why crossing off a tiny checkbox feels good. That's your brain reinforcing identity alignment. And this is where it gets practical. On the days when you don't feel like showing up, those days matter the most. Why? Because the action you take when it's hard is what rewires the narrative. That's when you prove to your brain, this is who I am, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. That's neuroplasticity in action. You're changing the structure and function of your nervous system by what you do under pressure. Now, let's get into thresholds. You need to design behaviors that are easy enough to do on your worst day. If the workout only counts when it's an hour long, you'll skip it when life gets messy. But if 10 push-ups counts, if 1 page of reading counts, if 2 minutes of journaling counts, you remove the excuse filter. This is called minimum viable effort. And it's one of the most powerful tools for building behavioral consistency. The brain loves completion. Even a small win triggers dopamine release, And that dopamine drives the desire to repeat the behavior tomorrow. Over time, small becomes automatic. Automatic becomes identity. Identity becomes trend transformation. Another key factor here is how you talk to yourself. Every time you say, I'm the kind of person who shows up, you're reinforcing neural pathways of reliability. Internal dialogue isn't fluff. It's a feedback loop. Your words shape your physiology. They shape your posture, your hormone profiles, your decision making. The most consistent people aren't just action takers. They're identity builders. They align who they say they are with what they repeatedly do. This is why systems matter more than goals. A goal is a destination, but a system is a pattern. And patterns are what your brain encodes. When you anchor your system to time, location, and action, wake up. Go to desks. Write one sentence. You're using behavioral anchoring. This is how we teach the nervous system to expect and prepare for effort. Eventually, the effort becomes the default state. Most people wait for motivation. But the truth is, consistency is what generates motivation, not the other way around. Dopamine doesn't just show up before action. It also gets released after you do something hard. That post-effort dopamine is what makes you want to repeat it. So if you want to feel motivated, do the thing first. Let biology handle the rest. This is how consistency becomes the weapon that wins wars. You use repetition to install identity. You use identity to guide behavior. And you use behavior to shape the future. If focus is how you win the battle, and consistency is how you win the war, then there has to be something that connects them. A bridge. A mechanism that allows short bursts of deep attention to evolve into long-term behavioral change. That bridge is your state, the internal condition of your nervous system, because your ability to focus or repeat a task isn't just about willpower or mindset. It's about whether you can control your physiological state on command. And when you learn how to do that, you gain access to a kind of internal switchboard that lets you shift gears, recover faster, and stay on track no matter what life throws at you. Every human being has two primary operating modes governed by the autonomic nervous system's sympathetic and parasympathetic. You've probably heard these referred to as fight or flight and rest and digest. But those labels are far too simplistic. In reality, these modes are fluid, dynamic, and constantly adjusting based on how you breathe, where you look, what you hear, and even what you believe about what you're doing. When you're alert, stressed, or stimulated, your sympathetic system takes over. Heart rate increases, pupils dilate, energy mobilizes. This is useful for short-term performance, but not for long-term sustainability. If you're always in this mode, you burn out. You lose clarity. You become reactive instead of strategic. On the other hand, the parasympathetic mode is what allows recovery, reflection, integration. It's where learning and adaptation happen. But if you're stuck here, you lose urgency, you become passive, and momentum fades. So what we need is the ability to move between these two states deliberately. What's called state modulation, and to train it like a skill. One of the most powerful ways to modulate your state is through breaths. Your breath is the only part of the autonomic nervous system you can control voluntarily. It's a steering wheel for your physiology. And one specific tool, something we call the physiological sigh, is uniquely effective for calming the nervous system within seconds. It's simple: 2 inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale through the mouth. The first inhale fills the lungs. The second inhale tops off the air sacs. The long exhale activates the vagus nerve and sends a message to your brain: you're safe, you can refocus. This isn't a hack. It's a biological reset. You can also influence your state through your visual system. Where and how you look tells your brain how to feel. When you're anxious or distracted, your vision tends to become narrow. You're in what's called foveal focus. That's fine for short bursts, but it increases sympathetic tone. To downshift your arousal level, practice panoramic vision. Simply soften your gaze and become aware of your peripheral field. This expands your spatial awareness and lowers internal tension. It's another tool for toggling between alertness and calm, between urgency and presence. And then there's the internal chemistry of motivation. Dopamine, once again, plays a key role, but not just in anticipation or reward. Dopamine also determines how long you can stay engaged with a process without immediate gratification. And this is crucial because in a world that promises fast results, your ability to delay gratification is now a competitive advantage. The question becomes, how do you increase dopamine in response to effort, not just success? One answer is to learn what I call dopamine scripting. You train yourself to associate pleasure with the act of striving, with the challenge itself. This is how elite performers stay consistent when the payoff is far away. They're not chasing the reward. They're wired to enjoy the pursuit. And this isn't just mindset. It's a neurological feedback loop. Every time you do something hard and say, "This is making me stronger," you release dopamine. That dopamine reinforces the behavior. The loop deepens. And eventually, you crave the effort. You crave the climb, not just the summit. There's also something to be said for controlling your internal narrative during high stress or high resistance moments. The stories you tell yourself shape your physiological state. If you approach your routine with the language of "I have to" or "I should," you create friction and resistance. But if you shift that language to "I choose to," or "This is who I am," you align your identity with your actions and your nervous system responds. Your cortisol levels drop. Your performance increases, and you stay on the path, not because you have to, but because your system believes that's who you are. And when setbacks happen, and they will, your ability to regulate your state becomes your most important asset. Because in those moments, you'll be tempted to spiral, to disconnect, to break the rhythm, But if you can pause, regulate your breath, shift your gaze, recalibrate your dopamine by acknowledging the progress, not just the gap, you stay in the game. You protect your consistency with tools, not emotion. With protocols, not panic. The beauty of this approach is that it's all trainable. Every day becomes an opportunity to practice state control. Every difficult moment becomes a rep. And over time, your baseline changes. You don't just react less, you respond better. You don't just get through the hard moments, you grow through them. Focus becomes your trigger. Consistency becomes your structure. But state control becomes your stabilizer.